Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 video. Today, we will be talking about the best and worst aspects of every single character, or at least we will be talking about the first half of the roster, because this would be a very long video otherwise, and I'd like to break that up. Plus, it's getting a little bit late as I'm recording this, so splitting things up this way will really kind of help make things a little bit more manageable. But I will have the link to the second part of this topic pinned in the tag or in the cards up below once that video is live after about a week. So hopefully you are able to stick around for both of those installments. But when I say aspects of each character, I mean there's a lot of really good things that every character has, and for most of these points, we'll be talking about their abilities. But for a few characters where I wasn't able to find something particularly bad, or none of their attributes were overall amazing, I did go ahead and pick a couple of other items out of the character's functionality to talk about in that instance. So we'll be covering the first half of the roster today. That goes through from Black Panther through SpiderMan, and then we'll pick up at Star-Lord and end with Thanos Infinite next week, just so you can kind of get a general idea of what we're looking to cover with this discussion topic. So starting off, we have Black Panther, and if you've watched any of the videos that I've put out in the past month, it should be fairly clear that the best attribute about this character is his Vibranium Slash. This is quite possibly the best ability in the game, especially if you are able to pair it up with this ISO in particular, where yes, it reverses your HP recovery and causes you to recover a percentage of your HP to be healed or otherwise reversed when attacking with your abilities, but it also increases your damage output by 300%, and that really helps in terms of getting the maximum damage yield out of that Vibranium Slash. It does encroach up on your opponents a little bit, so you have to know the spacing for it, but once you're familiar with how that ability works, you can tear through so many different fights in this game. For the worst attribute of Black Panther's kit, I do think that the worst thing is Bast's Fury, and the problem with Bast's Fury doesn't so much have to deal with it being a terrible ability, because it does have a lot of power that it can punch, but the biggest issue that I find with it is the fact that he ends up in a very lengthy animation upon releasing it, and you don't get as much bang for your buck as you otherwise would with other types of abilities or other abilities in Black Panther's kit, to say the least. Now, it is really good at avoiding some of the hazards on the stage, particularly I'm thinking of the Panther laser or the moving laser grids that are parts of the DLC. You can use it to get around those hazards, but at the same time, it doesn't really have nearly as much potential as other abilities within Black Panther's kit. Moving on to Black Widow. Now, Black Widow overall is a fairly underwhelming character, but the thing that I like the best about her is her Widow's Kiss, and the biggest reason that I like this is it is an attack that you can angle a little bit as it's being used, but it powers up the remainder of your team's moves with the shock attribute, and that really helps just the general aesthetic of the team when it comes to getting additional damage on your attacks. It's never something that you're really going to have trouble with. When it comes to the worst aspect of Black Widow's kit, it's the covering fire. This just does not provide the damage that's needed for really any type of combat. Yeah, you can kind of pick off your opponents from a distance, but it's not great, all things considered, and by far the weakest of the abilities out of all the abilities that Black Widow has. Captain America up next, and his kit is fairly well-rounded, but the absolute best aspect of his kit is the Super Soldier's ability. You get to buff up your entire team's offensive capabilities for 40 seconds when you have this ability increased to its maximum potential, and that is just phenomenal in terms of accelerating your ability to conduct combat, especially before you get access to some of the higher end characters such as Thanos Infinite. He really helps turn the tide of fights, and I've applied him to my team for a couple of the trickier Infinity Rifts just to make sure that I have that extra push to meet the requirements that are needed. When it comes to the worst aspect of his kit, again, this one isn't particularly terrible, but the shield strike, it's relatively inconsistent and a little bit contingent on the area that you're in and elemental hazards. If you're in a smaller enclosed space, it'll tend to do a little bit better because it can ricochet off of the walls as opposed to just the opponents in the area, but it can't be synergized when you initiate the attack, and so that can prove to be pretty problematic with getting any sort of beneficial use out of the shield strike. And the reason I put the shield strike here instead of absolute defense is absolute defense is really easy and quick to activate and take down. You don't spend a lot of time waiting around when entering or exiting this ability. So the shield strike just doesn't have as much of a utility when you look at the kit as a whole. Captain Marvel is next on our list, and she has a phenomenal ability in the aspect of her blast off. This allows her to attack into her opponents with a very powerful uppercut, and she even tacks on or can tack on a falling aerial out of that to further extend the damage that she's capable of dealing. And all things considered, this is a really, really good damage dealing aspect of her kit. But when it comes to the worst thing that she has to offer, it's the Cosmic Beam. It's really bad. Beam attacks in general are just really bad. They're not meant to be high damage yield type abilities, and the Cosmic Beam is no different. Sure, it does allow you to engage your opponents from a distance, but with the lackluster damage that it offers, you're better off using any other ability, even if you're just using it as a chase down option. You can get more reliability out of the rundown that you would get from a Photon Punch than the chip damage that you'll get out of using the Cosmic Beam. Crystal, I think, is one of my favorite designs that I've seen in this game. I really like the intention of how her kit was meant to work. I don't feel like it was executed as well as it could have been, though, so unfortunately I don't really give her a lot of use. However, her Cyclone ability is really powerful because it can be comboed with other abilities in her kit, and it lasts for a decent amount of time, especially if you charge it up before unleashing it, as it then makes its way across the battlefield. So a lot of potential combo that you can do with that Cyclone, but in all things considered, she doesn't have a ton of bragging rights with how her kit actually works. And the worst aspect of her kit has to be the Hydroblast. I get that it's meant to be the chill or freezing type damage dealer, but it is incredibly short in its duration. It does not last long at all, and that is really problematic, especially if you're looking to deal large bursty amounts of damage. If you're looking for large bursty amounts, you better check the Fire Burst option instead of the Hydroblast, because you're just not going to get the bang for your buck when using that Hydroblast ability. Daredevil is next on our list, and it's no surprise here, the top option on his kit is the Radar Sense. Being able to lower your opponent's defense is a really good attribute. I don't think it's quite as useful as the Super Soldier's ability from Captain America, because I'd rather see a team buff than a opponent debuff. And the other thing that knocks this down a peg is Radar Sense is subject to wherever Daredevil is, whereas Super Soldiers will soup up the characters wherever they are on the battlefield. But it's still really good. I don't mean to downplay it because it is a phenomenal ability and can help you close out fights pretty quickly if you're able to use it efficiently. When it comes to the worst aspect of Daredevil's kit, I really don't like his Billy Club Blitz. I don't think that it offers the amount of damage that it advertises, and it's especially not good when you take into consideration that Daredevil is meant to burst down a lot of the characters that you're having swarm around you, and this just doesn't cut it against mighty enemies as soon as they go into that blocking stance. You don't get far at all, and you're much better off using either the Vigilante Justice or the Blind Fury as opposed to the Billy Club Blitz. That and these affect a much wider array of space as opposed to what the Billy Club Blitz offers. So yeah, this one just doesn't quite sell it for me. Now, Deadpool. Deadpool is a really good character in terms of what they could have done. I feel like a couple of his options, though quippy and unique to him, don't really offer what you would hope that it does. The Katana-rama is by far the best option in his kit, as it allows him to spin and slash forward, dealing large amounts of damage to the opponents that are in his way as he barrels through them. And it does a very good job at clearing through those smaller grunt-type opponents. But he has two abilities that are really lackluster in the form of Make It Rain and Eat Lead. Eat Lead is just the worst between the two because it's really bad. It's probably one of the worst rapid fire abilities in the game because it has that burst firing that you have to spam over and over again, and short bursty rounds just really don't cut it. And furthermore, he adjusts every single time that you use that ability, meaning that he could end up pointing his weapon in vastly different directions and decreasing the overall yield that you would get out of the potential damage here. Wish a couple of things were done differently with his kit, but he still does have a couple of unique quirks to offer when it comes to in-game combat. Doctor Strange, I've talked about this before. He is my favorite character in Marvel Comics, but he is not done the justice that he should have been in this game. When it comes to damage that he's capable of dealing, the Bolts of Balthok is by far the best ability that he has, especially because it has the potential to hit twice on opponents that are directly in front of or behind him when using the ability. Now, it's by no means a damage-dealing ability that holds a candle to other members of the cast, but within his kit, it is his best option for dealing that damage. The worst option in his kit is instead the Winds of Watum. The Winds of Watum is just a very poorly executed team healing ability, and it eats up a lot of his energy points that could otherwise be used helping your opponents, or your other team members, I should say, in combat. I just really wish that they would have given Doctor Strange something else to let him hit that much harder, as opposed to giving him a support type ability, which sees little to no use in actual combat. Next up, we have Drax. Drax is a very interesting character in his own right, and yes, he did make my list of top 10 worst characters in the game, but it's not by a whole lot, because he still has a couple of intriguing things that he does have to offer. His best option in his kit is the Destroyer's Rage, mainly because it allows him to hit on all sides of him as he dashes forward, and that puts it ahead of the Twin Slash, because that prioritizes the space directly in front of him as he dashes forward. Both abilities still are useful and have their own unique perks to using one over the other, but Destroyer's Rage holds the edge in terms of how efficiently it performs. When it comes to the worst aspect of his kit, we have the Ground Smash. I really hate this ability. It does not do near enough of what it advertises, and for being a up-close melee brawler, you'd expect an attack that he hits into the ground would do a lot better job at offering some of the crowd control that he's meant for, but it really doesn't, and a lot of times it actually ends up being counterintuitive to what you're meaning to do with this character. So, all things considered, it's not a far cry between what's his worst and his best, but this certainly hits that list. Next up, we have Elsa Bloodstone. Elsa Bloodstone's another one of those characters that was really cool that they were included, because not a lot of people know of this character. But it's another character that was kind of done an injustice in terms of how they were represented. The best ability is right here off of the start. and it is the fully stocked ability because it allows her to make physical contact with her opponents, kind of give her a little bit of some get off me tool, or give her a little bit of space between her and her opponents there. And then she does attack into them with some additional projectile hits, but there's nothing super impressive across her kit as a whole. This just has a couple of different simultaneous options that allow her to deal damage and do so fairly quickly. In terms of the worst thing in her kit, the shotgun blast is really bad. It takes forever to charge up, and it doesn't offer anything compelling when it actually lands on an opponent. It's just not what you're looking for in terms of large amounts of damage. You get a little bit better yield with the double barrel because you can at least hit twice and continue to use that ability, even though it does take up a fair amount of time to finally be executed. And the bullet bombardment isn't overly strong, but at least it hits on all sides of the character and allows you to build up a little bit more space around you. But fairly underwhelming character, all things considered. The shotgun blast is just the most underwhelming thing that she has to offer. Next, we have Falcon. Falcon has a lot of pretty interesting things in his kit. By far, the best option is the Twisting Talon because it allows him to dash forward and hit multiple different opponents. I don't particularly like the other abilities in his kit because they have really weird movement that doesn't help him out a whole lot. And when it comes to the worst aspect of his kit, this is one of the first deviations that I have, because the Razor Storm does have its uses. Instead, I think the worst thing about Falcon's kit is his heavy attack. He just has a really weird forward dashing spin that doesn't really offer any benefits, and it sends the opponents that he crashes into off to the side more often than it does kicking them out further in front of him, and then you've got to rush down those opponents to finish them off. It's not really an ideal thing to see in those types of combat circumstances, and you're better off using other abilities in his kit as opposed to trying to attack in with that heavy attack because of the way that it throws the opponents around. Gamora is up next, and she's really good at a couple of different things. I think she's the best character that you have in that initial squad of the Guardians of the Galaxy when playing a new game. Unfortunately, when you are playing from that new game, you don't have access to some of the better attacks in her kit. Of course, I'm talking about the Godslayer and the Assassin's Strike. More specifically, Assassin's Strike is really good because it allows her to close the distance between her opponents and deals a large amount of damage, particularly to those stagger gauges of your opponents. And that's really good for burning down those heavier hitting characters. When it comes to the worst aspects of her kit, you probably already know what it is based off of what I've said from other characters, but it's the Deadly Aim. These rapid fire type abilities just do not have the damage output to justify any amount of use, especially when it comes to using these abilities in actual combat. The most that you're going to get out of it is finishing off some of the characters that are already fairly low on health, and even then you'd be better off rushing them down so you can at least gain some energy points back from attacking into them. Next on our docket, we have Ghost Rider. Ghost Rider is super awesome for a lot of different things, and he has a lot of range on his attacks that kind of makes him a surprising combatant. And when it comes to the best thing in his kit as a whole, I really like the Hellfire Chain. And this is particularly good because it hits a wide area of effect all the way around the character. You can use it over and over again to just continue to attack and chain damage onto your opponents. It's very good for covering space, and that's a thing that you really like to see with these heavy type characters. It's just pretty solid when it comes to comparing the other aspects of his kit. The worst thing in his kit is probably a bit of a controversial take, and I actually think it's the Hell Cycle. And though this attack hits really hard, the problem that I have with it is more particularly in large open spaces, because it sends you rocketing across the battlefield, and that often leaves you disengaged from the opponents that you were attacking into, meaning that if you just burst someone's stagger gauge, you're not going to be able to follow up on that attack because you're going to be on the other side of the battlefield, and that's never a good place to be in, especially when you are the team's heavy-hitting character. it's just not a feasible way to disengage yourself from a fight, especially because you're missing up on those follow-up opportunities that you have just created for yourself. Moving on to Rocket and Groot, this character is very underwhelming. I really like what they were going for in terms of a tandem character, and the best attribute of this character is, honestly, the fact that you can execute light and heavy attacks simultaneously, because that allows you to get a decent amount of chip damage in with Rocket, while at the same time kind of sweeping the lower grunt type characters away with Groot's arms as he sweeps out in his immediate vicinity. But none of their abilities are particularly useful, and by far the bottom of the barrel is the Quantum Igniter. Not only is this a beam type attack, and I've talked about how I feel about beam type attacks, but this one in particular, the destination of the shot being fired is contingent on where Groot goes, not where Rocket's aiming, and Rocket doesn't auto-target onto your opponents either. It is the worst beam type attack in the game because it is so inconsistent, and Groot's movements are fairly erratic as you're walking around the battlefield. Do not use this ability if you know what's good for you. Next up, we have Hawkeye. Hawkeye, again, a fairly lackluster character, and I think that the biggest problem with that is he is a projectile-based attacker in a brawler-style game, and it wasn't done very well. It's very hard to do that type of a character well, but the way that they tried to make that work with Hawkeye, though they did represent him faithfully in terms of how he would conduct his combat, it just leaves a lot to be desired. The best attribute of his kit, however, is the shock value. I really do like the spread that this ability has of firing out multiple different arrows in a fan out in front of him, and it can incapacitate your opponents because it has that shock attribute applied to it. There are other characters that do that a lot better than what Hawkeye does, but at least it's an option that he has. And when it comes to the worst aspect of his kit, I hate the piercing shot. It does not deliver on anything as far as what it advertises that it does. And there are other abilities in this game that advertise a similar effect, but just do it that much better. A very clear example of that, Punisher's sniper shot. It delivers so much more than the piercing shot from Hawkeye. And I just don't get any enjoyment out of using this character because it feels like I'm fighting an uphill battle the entire time that I'm using him. Next up is Hulk. Hulk is a phenomenal character. I highly recommend using him on basically any team that you look to use or implement because he just hits so hard and he's so versatile in what he's able to do. Hulk's best ability in terms of getting large amounts of damage and yield is the Thunderclap because he is a very up-close and personal brawler, but the Thunderclap allows him to hit out very far away from him and really layer in damage against his opponents. It's really good at clearing out large groups of those grunt-type abilities or characters as well. And when it comes to the worst thing in Hulk's kit, honestly, all of his abilities are solid, and I don't have any real complaints about any of them. And the biggest thing that I have that's a problem with Hulk is he doesn't have a good use for his falling aerial. And I know that's a bit of a stretch or a bit of a grasp, but I really would have liked to see him use his leap and bound type ability where you can hit that falling aerial maybe 3 times in sequence with each strike getting a little bit stronger and maybe bouncing you around the battlefield. I just think that that would have been fun. It would have been canonically accurate, and it would have been overall more useful to him than the other attacks that he has. But I understand why that wasn't done, because Hulk is still a very strong character in his current iteration, and you wouldn't want to make him too overpowered. So I'm going to be complacent with what he has at his current iteration. Next up on our list, we have Iron Fist. Iron Fist is fairly middle of the road, all things considered. He still has a couple of things that allow him to hit fairly hard, but not nearly as much when compared to other members of the team that deal that same type of up-close quarters combat. His Thunder Kick, I think, is his best option when it comes to dealing that bursty amounts of damage, because it deals a lot of damage itself, but it's also his go-to option when it comes to bursting down those stagger gauges and helps him to close the gap when he does so. The other abilities in his kit aren't as consistent at getting that damage as the Thunder Kick is. But when it comes to the worst thing that he has, it's definitely the Key Focus. The Key Focus just doesn't do things the same way that the rest of his kit does, and it kind of makes it feel a little disjointed. It hits in a 360-degree area immediately in his vicinity, and that's not always what you want. Sure, it's a decent tool to get some of those grunt characters off of you if you are in a moment where you're surrounded, but if that's what you're looking for, you're going to be better off using something like Rise of the Dragon, because it will launch those opponents into the air and deal more damage, all things considered. Key Focus not bad by any means, it's just not great compared to other options in his kit. Next up, we have Iron Man. Iron Man, he's a fairly middle-of-the-road character as well. Not a whole lot of crazy things in his kit. I do really like his thruster charge. Again, this really helps attacking into those mighty and boss type enemies and can deal a lot of damage. The charge type attacks are probably one of the better categories in the game as a whole. But this one definitely is the shining item within Iron Man's kit specifically. But when it comes to the worst thing, again, looking at this, it should be fairly obvious to you what it is. It's the Unibeam. Unibeam is just not consistent with dealing the damage that you need or want it to, and it's highly conditional as to whether or not you should be using it to burn down other opponents, especially the smaller grunt type opponents that are needing to be knocked out. If you really need to do something like that, you're better off using the Missile Barrage, because that will hone in on the opponent, as opposed to you taking your time to try and trace them down with the beam attack that Iron Man is using. Luke Cage is up next, and he has a lot of really good things in his kit. Particularly, I love the Chain Gang, because it's a step up from Ghost Rider's Hellfire Chain, because he does still swing a chain around, but if he grabs onto a grunt-type enemy, it will wrap them up, and then he will slam them down onto the ground, once behind him and then once back in front of him, and deals massive amounts of damage to any of the opponents that are hit with that chain as he slams it down into the ground. Overall, phenomenal ability in combat and being able to layer through your opponents. When it comes to the worst thing that Luke Cage has to do, it's fairly similar to the complaint that I had with Drax, where the Power Slam just does not deliver in the realm of what it's expected to do. Especially if you're looking to clear space around you, you're going to want to use the Chain Gang 9 times out of 10 anyway. Again, it just doesn't have the power or the punch that you would need it to out of this type of an ability, and there's just other abilities in his kit that do the same thing, but better. So that's my cautionary warning with using Luke Cage on your team. Miles Morales is next, and this character is a ton of fun. He was one of the first characters that I got up to level 300, and what I really like about Miles' kit is his Surprise Strike, because it allows him to kind of teleport around the battlefield or sneak around the battlefield and deliver striking blows to the mighty type enemies. And there's a bunch of abilities that are similar to this, but the attribute that this attack has that other characters just don't is the Surprise Strike can be used in a synergy type attack, and other Disappearing Act type attacks cannot be utilized that way, which is really just a step backwards, in my opinion. There's a lot of good power that you can get out of a well-timed Surprise Strike. When it comes to the worst attribute in his kit, it has to go to the Web Shooter. A lot of Web Warriors have this type of ability where they will attack into their opponents with their Web Shooters. It's fine, because that's very much within their kit. The problem with Miles Morales' ability is it doesn't even have the chance to bind up opponents. It just releases those Web Blasts and sure deals a little bit of shock damage to them as well. But you really want to try and find something that can bind up your opponents, and Miles just can't deliver on that facet. Now we're on to Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel's kit overall isn't particularly awesome. All of her abilities are very basic in terms of what they have to offer, but one of the abilities that stands out in her kit is the super face kick. This ability allows her to kind of distance herself from her opponents while taking a forward stride that deals a lot of damage and also will rip through the stagger gauges of her opponents. Everything else in her kit is fairly lackluster. This is really the best damage dealing option that she has that executes pretty quickly as well. When it comes to the worst thing in her kit, it's gotta be the sweet combo attack. Yes, she does a flurry of punches directly in front of her, but look at those stats, even with the ability fully upgraded. It has F classifications to damage and stagger damage dealt. There's no reality where you will want to be using this ability as opposed to the Embiggen or the giant foot spinny thing. It's just not great and does not deliver on any meaningful damage in combat. Next up, we have Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler is another one of those characters that kind of breaks the mold for this this format that we've been going with. The best thing about Nightcrawler is his teleport mechanic, because it is the fastest teleportation mechanic in the game. It's crucial to speedrunning this game. I know I'm a little bit biased when it comes to that because I have all of the single player speedrun records, and you just can't do any of those without this character. It would just get too long and too grueling of a task to have any sort of merit attached to it. And that feels like a bit of a cop-out, but this is my list and I can do what I want with it. When it comes to the worst aspect of Nightcrawler's kit, it's right here. It's the first ability that he had, the Swashbuckler, and this allows him to pop in and out around the battlefield and deal some decent slashing damage against his opponents, but it's highly inconsistent and you cannot target the same character twice in a row, which means that a lot of the time you're going to be blinking back and forth all around the place, and that just wastes unnecessary energy points when and if you're using this character as your main damage dealer, which you really shouldn't be because he is a better mobile character as opposed to damage dealer. Psylocke is up next. I've spoken very highly about Psylocke, and there is a lot of really great things about her. Her best attribute, in my opinion, is the Katana Slash. It deals large amounts of damage and, again, can be comboed with a Falling Aerial to further extend the damage that you're dealing with this character, as well as build up more of your energy points. It's a very heavy-hitting and quick-moving ability that has a lot of utility behind it. When it comes to the worst thing in her kit, it goes back to the Psionic Blast. This goes back to the same type of complaint that I had with Iron Fist and his key focus. It just doesn't deal the amount of damage that you would hope that it would, especially when compared to other attributes in her kit. And if there's a moment where you would be using the Psionic Blast, you'd better opt for the Katana Slash because it executes a lot quicker and deals damage a lot more efficiently than what the Psionic Blast could ever hope to do. Now we're on to Scarlet Witch. The best thing about Scarlet Witch is she is a character on the roster in this game. The worst thing about Scarlet Witch is her entire kit. From her basic attacks to her heavy attacks to all of the abilities on screen before you, this character is just fundamentally broken, and not in a good way. She does not work as advertised. She can only synergize one of her abilities, and that ability is lackluster at best. This character would be very well suited for a top to bottom remaster and rework to be worth even discussing further. Next on our list, we have SpiderGwen. SpiderGwen is, again, one of those characters that isn't overly impressive in most of the things that she does. But one of the things that she does really well is this legit beatdown, and this ability is particularly good because it will hit on all sides of the character as she swings this ball of webbing around her, and then she does launch it, but it launches in kind of a weird angle, so you don't get as much damage out of it as you would hope to. It just does a lot more reliable attacks when it comes to comparing things to the rest of her kit. When it comes to the worst thing that she has to offer, we have the catchy attack name. And this does better than the ability that we talked about with Miles Morales. It does better than his web shooter because this ability can actually bind up opponents and render them vulnerable to follow-up attacks from yourself or other members of your team. But it's a very wasteful ability when it comes to the energy points that she uses to execute it. There's other abilities that just do a lot better in terms of layering damage into her opponents. And sure, it's nice to render them immobile to be able to carry out those follow-ups, but there's other characters that do that a lot better if you are looking to bind up a character. And finally, for today's video, we have Spider-Man. Spider-Man is, again, a character that has some interesting utility, but a lot of things that he has are just kind of repetitive. I think that's the best way to say that. His Web Crush is by far the best ability in his kit because it deals a lot of damage and he's able to swing that ball of webbing around. The difference here is he swings it around himself as he's airborne as opposed to dragging it around him in a circle like SpiderGwen does, but it still deals a decent amount of damage. Now, the other abilities in his kit aren't particularly great, but they all have the aspect of being able to bind opponents. The ability that does this the best is his Sticky Situation, and the reason that it does the best is because he shoots out webbing all over the place in 360 degrees for a couple of seconds as he spins around in the air after jumping upwards to execute this ability. He can web up multiple opponents, you don't have to be particularly scrupulous about where you're targeting them, and it does very well and doesn't have a mind on its own, an AI-reliant spider drone type binding, and it's not player-influenced binding with the web spinner. It's by far the better of his options, and by that I would put web spinner at the very bottom because you're the one up to whether or not that web spinner is actually going to bind up your opponents as opposed to letting the computer or just sheer overpowering might take the wheel on that. But that's going to be where we stop things for today. Do you agree with the assessments of these characters? Be sure to let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. If you enjoyed today's video, feel free to leave a like, and we'll be back next week to carry out the same breakdown for the other half of the cast. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day.